Deep in every pilot's psyche, there resides an acutely trained mental process which is dedicated solely to aiding the pilot's reaction in a time-critical emergency situation. As pilots, we inherently accept the fact that emergencies or abnormal situations can arise, and however slight the chance of experiencing a real-life emergency may be, a great pilot will always have a mental plan of attack should such a situation arise. Oftentimes, this plan could evolve from the memory of a checklist or even from the recollection of a thorough pre-flight brief. Regardless, each pilot's individual reaction to any number of abnormal or emergency situations will be predicated on the amount and quality of that pilot's previous training and the breadth of his or her experience as an aviator. On this UND Aerocast episode, we will attempt to tackle the decision-making and procedural steps specific to the Cessna 172 that must combine to give a pilot the best chance of surviving an engine failure and a subsequent emergency approach and landing. Please, as with any UND Aerocast episode, understand that this video is designed to supplement your aviation education, and at no time should you attempt any emergency simulation in an aircraft unless on a dual flight with a certified flight instructor. The objective of a simulated emergency landing is to develop the pilot's accuracy, judgment, planning, procedures, and confidence when little or no power is available. The airplane will be flown from the point of simulated engine failure to where a safe landing could be made utilizing proper emergency cockpit procedures. When an engine fails, the pilot is confronted with a situation known as a forced landing. Because whether or not the engine has completely failed or is experiencing a significant power reduction, the airplane has now reached a point where further continued flight is impossible. The decision-making process and procedural steps that follow the engine failure will be based on the time a pilot has to address the situation. And in the case of an engine failure, time is an absolute function of altitude. According to Chapter 16 in the FAA's Airplane Flying Handbook, you can assume that from the point of an engine failure, the average pilot reaction time will be about 4 seconds. The maximum glide chart in Chapter 3 of the Cessna 172 POH shows that a 172 with a windmilling propeller and flaps up will maintain a gliding descent at approximately 800 feet per minute as long as the pilot maintains the best glide speed of 68 knots. Now, an engine failure can obviously occur at any infinite combination of altitudes and airspeeds. Simplifying this thought, we can say that the way we as pilots address the engine failure will be determined by whether the failure occurs at a higher or lower altitude. An engine failure at 4,000 feet AGL should give an average pilot the time necessary to troubleshoot the problem, secure the airplane, and choose the most ideal landing spot. In contrast, an engine failure at, say, 800 feet AGL just after takeoff and at a low airspeed may only allow the pilot enough time to lower the nose and select a limited amount of landing points to either side of the departure path. If a pilot were to experience an engine failure during cruise at 4,000 AGL, the initial response should be to take a breath, focus, and fly the airplane. This means that the pilot must control the airplane's pitch in order to achieve the best glide speed, and the pilot must maintain coordination with rudder in order to avoid a stall spin situation. Remember, aviate, navigate, and then communicate. By flying the plane, the pilot is buying some time. The pilot should be constantly trimming the airplane and holding altitude while airspeed slows from cruise to best glide speed. As the airplane continues to decelerate, the pilot must run the memorized engine failure flight checklist specific to the Cessna 172. This initial memory procedure is designed as a quick troubleshoot to help the pilot get the engine restarted. If the engine fails to restart, the pilot's thought process must immediately turn to the successful completion of a forced landing. Maintaining best glide airspeed, the pilot will now begin searching for a general landing area and plan to maneuver to touch down as close as possible to that selected area. As the power-off glide continues, the pilot should quickly narrow this area down to a specific landing spot as the terrain becomes more visible and defined. A suitable touchdown spot should be based on several factors, including the direction and strength of the wind, and the presence of obstacles near and around the point. Typically, a compromise will have to be made between wind direction and known obstacles, but ultimately the pilot is attempting to choose a point that will allow for the airplane to be landed into the wind with minimum obstacles in the approach or landing path. By landing into the wind, the pilot is minimizing the airplane's ground speed as much as possible at the point of touchdown. A slower relative ground speed will also help to minimize the subsequent ground roll and will give the pilot and passengers a better chance to avoid injury should the landing encounter obstacles or unanticipated hazards. Once the pilot has chosen an adequate landing spot, the glide should be diverted in a straight line until the airplane is directly above the point of intended touchdown. With this accomplished, the pilot has essentially guaranteed that the spot can be reached. If you haven't watched it already, it's time to go back and review the Aerocast episode entitled Steep Spirals, because this is the point where the pilot can put that training to use by circling down over the planned touchdown spot. The plan should be to end up abeam the touchdown spot on the downwind at about 1,000 feet AGL, which is a typical traffic pattern altitude. Now, before committing all focus and resources on just making the landing, it's time to secure the cabin and prepare for that landing. As the airplane continues its controlled, circling glide, the pilot must first verify that every item in the emergency memory items checklist has been completed, including the additional 3 non-memory items. Once these items have been verified, and the pilot is assured that the engine will not restart, he or she can proceed to the UND Cessna 172 Power Off Landing Checklist. The first 4 items in this checklist are memory items. The rest of the checklist includes non-memory items that should be read and verified from the checklist. These items will only be accomplished if time and altitude permit, and in our current example, time should be on the pilot's side, at least enough so that all items on the checklist can be accomplished. Once this checklist has been completed, the pilot can be assured that the airplane has been configured properly for the imminent emergency landing. The pilot will then continue the glide with positive airplane control down to the point of intended landing. As the 172 passes the abeam point at approximately 1,000 feet AGL, the pilot can commence a power-off 180-degree approach and landing. Flaps should be extended when the pilot is assured the point will be made. If encountering a stronger than expected headwind on final, the pilot can delay flap extension until he or she feels it is necessary. Remember, flaps are beneficial because they will allow the airplane to touch down on the terrain at the slowest airspeed and ground speed possible. However, flaps can also be a detriment in this situation because their extension will always yield a shorter gliding distance and may cause the pilot to end up short of the point or in a position that he or she is attempting to stretch the glide with insufficient airspeed. The pilot must always maintain a safe approach airspeed and avoid any stall spin situation. Remember, it is better to land on less desirable terrain under controlled flight than on any terrain during uncontrolled flight. Next, the pilot will continue the approach and touch down at a slow but controlled airspeed in a nose-high attitude and as close to the intended touchdown point as possible. Depending on the terrain, the touchdown and rollout may be smooth and uneventful, or it may be violent and damage the aircraft. In either case, the pilot should ensure that all passengers are evacuated immediately and instructed to remain near the aircraft until emergency services arrive. During the winter, the upper Midwest region of the United States, and North Dakota in particular, will present some of the harshest and most extreme temperatures in North America. For this reason, it cannot be stressed enough that pilots should always be carrying cold weather survival equipment and must undergo some form of cold weather training. In the case of an engine failure during the winter, the pilot must activate his or her emergency locator transmitter as soon as possible. Under most circumstances, the pilot and passengers have the best chance of surviving if they remain with the airplane and its available shelter. In the end, it is up to the judgment of the pilot in command when making a decision to stay with the airplane or perhaps walk to a nearby populated area. 4,000 feet AGL. Level, cruise flight. Your engine has failed. Proceeding step by step, we will simulate this emergency in real time based on the Cessna 172's best glide airspeed rate of descent. Take a breath, fly the airplane, and then work the problem. As airspeed reduces to best glide, run the memory items on the Cessna's engine failure flight checklist. Airspeed, 68 knots. Fuel selector valve, both. Fuel shutoff valve, on. Mixture, rich. Fuel pump, on. Magneto switch, both. Now the checklist is completed, the engine won't start, airspeed has now settled to best glide, and we are still at our original engine failure altitude, so we have some time. Immediately decide on a general touchdown area. Over there looks good. It seems as though there are minimal obstacles and favorable terrain. Let's start heading in that direction. As the glide continues, we notice a small farm road with no power lines, small ditches, and no trees in the approach or landing paths. Let's plan to land into the wind on the road about 200 feet past the intersection. As we get directly above our intended landing spot, we can check that our glide airspeed is maintaining and proceed with pulling out our checklist and verifying the engine failure flight portion. Don't forget, this verification will also include the 3 non-memory items. Engine instruments, check. Magnetos, check. Fuel pump, off. As this checklist is completed, the memory items on the power off landing checklist will be initiated. Airspeed, 68 knots. Place to land, pilot option. Seat backs, most upright position. Seats and seat belts, secure. Since time and altitude permit, we can initiate the non-memory portion of this checklist. Transponder, 7700. Radio, transmit. ELT, on. Throttle, idle. Mixture, idle cutoff. Fuel shutoff valve, off. Magnetos, off. Flaps, as required. Alternator and battery master switches, off. Standby battery switch, off. Doors, unlatch. Approach speed, 65 knots. As we finish that checklist, we are well into our second gliding turn and are attempting to make our abeam point about 1,000 feet above the terrain, which, based on our trusty sectional chart, is about 1,400 feet MSL. Adding 1,000 feet, we'll plan to be at 2,400 feet on our altimeter at the abeam point. Now the aircraft is secured, we have notified ATC of our emergency, and they are sending emergency services to our location, aided by the guidance of our emergency locator transmitter. We have a plan for landing, and we still have some time to spare. Fast forward to the abeam point. We know we are approximately 1,000 feet above the ground, and we can guess the wind strength by observing the rate of our movement over the ground and plan accordingly for the power-off 180-degree approach. We decide to turn on to final. Flaps will be extended slowly to their full extent since we are confident that the touchdown point just past the intersection can be reached. The rest of the approach will be normal, flown at 65 knots, and we will initiate a normal flare and touchdown at the slowest airspeed possible. From the point of engine failure to the successful and safe touchdown, we had just over 5 minutes, and we used every second to our advantage. You are at 800 feet AGL on the climb-out just after takeoff. Airspeed is 80 knots. Your engine has failed. Take a breath. Fly the airplane by pitching the nose forward and achieve the Cessna's best glide speed, assuring that the airspeed stays well above stall. Now, immediately execute the engine failure memory items. The memory items are completed. the engine has failed to restart. We must direct our full attention to flying the airplane, maintaining positive control, and landing on the most suitable spot that the immediate terrain has to offer. Since our airspeed is slow and we have very little altitude to work with, we will elect to proceed in a forward direction while making slight and shallow maneuvering turns, and we'll decide to land to the left of those trees in that rough-looking field up to the left of our nose. As our descent continues, we notice we will in fact make the field. As we extend flaps, we issue a quick mayday to ATC and prepare for the landing. Once again, our approach is made at a normal airspeed, and our flap application allows us to touch down at an even slower airspeed. Since we departed the runway into the wind, electing to continue straight ahead for the power-off landing has yielded the ability to also land into the wind, and has minimized our ground speed during the impact and rollout into the dirt field. In this example, the time from engine failure on the departure leg to a landing in the dirt field was 1 minute and 20 seconds. These are two contrasting examples designed to illustrate for you, the student, the procedural steps involved with safely and successfully executing an emergency approach and landing in the unlikely event of an engine failure and subsequent failed restart. Understand that this procedure should only be simulated and practiced on dual flights with a UND certified flight instructor under controlled and pre-briefed conditions. According to the UND Aerospace Cessna 172 standardization manual, at no time should the pilot continue the simulated emergency glide past 500 feet AGL unless he or she is conducting a dual flight with an instructor on board, and a stabilized approach and landing can be made at a UND-approved airport. Upon reaching 500 feet AGL, the pilot must initiate a normal go-around and return to cruise flight in his or her practice area. The FAA's Private Pilot Practical Test Standards booklet prescribes several standards that must be met by the private pilot candidate before this maneuver can be considered satisfactory on an FAA check ride. Prior to taking the check ride, the pilot must verify that he or she exhibits knowledge of the elements related to emergency approach and landing procedures, analyzes the situation and selects an appropriate course of action, establishes and maintains the recommended best glide airspeed within plus or minus 10 knots, selects a suitable landing area, plans and follows a flight pattern to the selected landing area considering altitude, wind, terrain, and obstructions, prepares for landing or go-around as specified by the examiner, and follows the appropriate checklist. Each emergency is unique, and with each emergency comes a unique set of situations and variables that will ultimately affect the pilot's decision-making process and the final outcome of that emergency. However, the procedures and techniques offered in this video are standardized. They are clear and to the point. They are presented step by step so that a pilot in a time-critical emergency situation may easily draw upon these learned procedures and take the necessary action in order to remedy the situation quickly and effectively. Should you ever, in your career, find yourself in a power-off emergency, or any emergency for that matter, fly the airplane first and have confidence that your training has prepared you to effect the most successful outcome possible.
From flight level 280 in UND King Air 200. Have fun and fly safe.